On the edge of the city, there was a wall that people no longer really saw. Once it had been new and bright. Fresh stone, sharp corners, letters cut deep and dark. On the day it was finished, the street had been full. People had stood in rows, holding flowers and small flags, listening to speeches about memory and duty and the price of certain years. Someone had played a slow song. Children had been told to keep quiet and behave. That was long ago. Now the city had grown in other directions. New roads went around the edge of the district. New shops and glass buildings had appeared closer to the center. The old memorial wall stood beside a tired small park between a bus depot and a row of garages, and most days it faced only cracked asphalt and thin grass. The names on it had faded. Rain had softened their edges. Frost had opened hairline cracks in the stone. Dust and soot from thousands of passing vehicles had darkened some parts and washed others pale. In a few sections, moss grew along the bottom line like an uneven green underline. Above the wall, the sky stayed busy. Clouds moved quickly there. Air from the fields outside the city rushed in and met the warmer air that rose from roofs and roads. In autumn, the wind liked this place. It ran its fingers over the rough stone and tugged at the small trees in the park. It whistled in the metal fence around the bus depot and rattled loose signs. On top of the wall, there was often a crow. The crow had found the place by accident at first. It had been following a line of rising air from the fields, circling, feeling the way the warmer current pushed its wings upward with less effort. From above, it had seen the long gray strip of stone, the straight rows carved across it, the bushes and lamps along its base. The crow liked edges. It liked boundary lines, where one kind of ground stopped and another began. The wall was an edge between the small park and the road, between the living city and names that belonged to a time before the crow had hatched. It landed on the top one morning and felt the roughness of the stone under its claws. From there, it could watch many things at once. Cars moved along the road. Buses came and went through the depot gate. Cats slipped between the garages. Children sometimes crossed the park on their way to school. Pigeons gathered near the bench where an old man threw crumbs. If the crow wanted, it could hop down and search the grass for dropped food or insects. It did that often, but again and again it returned to the long horizontal path of the wall. At first, the names meant nothing to the bird. They were only shapes. A row of cuts in the stone, darker where water collected, lighter where someone had once tried to scrub soot away. The crow walked along them as it would walk along a branch, placing one clawed foot after the other, shifting its weight, balancing with its tail. The first time something changed, the weather had turned cold. Autumn had deepened. Leaves in the small park had turned the color of old copper and then fallen, gathering in wet piles against the base of the wall. The air above the bus depot smelled of diesel and wood smoke. A gray sky moved fast, and the wind came over the fields with a long, low push. The crow was on the left end of the wall, near the place where the first names began. It lifted one foot, set it down on the stone between two carved lines, and tilted its head. A gust of wind slid along the length of the wall at that moment, pressing against the bird's feathers. The crow felt the familiar pressure, but with it came a sound. The wind ran over the carved letters and pulled a thin whisper from them. It did not form a clear word. It was more like the start of a word, the breath, before a voice becomes fully shaped. The crow heard it as a short, rising note that matched the small movement of its own body. The bird stood very still. Wind was not new. The crow had flown through storms and strong gusts. It knew the sound of air around branches and buildings. But this was different. The whisper had come not from the leaves or the fence or the wires above the street. It had come from the stone beneath its feet. The crow took another step. Claws scraped lightly over pale chips of old dust. The bird moved forward until it stood above the next row. As it did, the wind surged again. This time, it struck the wall at a slightly different angle. Another whisper rose. It came from the shallow groove of another name. A different note, a slightly changed length. The crow's feathers trembled along its back. The bird walked. Step by step, it moved along the top line of the wall. With each small motion, with each new cluster of carved letters below, the wind shifted and touched them. Sometimes the air rose stronger, sometimes softer, but over and over it seemed to follow the path of the crow's feet. To a person, it might still have sounded like nothing more than gusts around a corner. To the crow, whose whole life depended on reading subtle changes in air, it felt ordered. It was as if the wind were following the bird's path and reading something with its breath. The crow did not have human thoughts about memory or history. It knew hunger, danger, shelter, flight, and the constant need to understand the sky. Yet even in its bird mind, there was a sense that this movement, this partnership between claws and wind, mattered. From that day on, the crow returned to the wall more often. It came in the early morning when the light was gray and flat. It came in the late afternoon when the sky over the garages turned orange and then red. It came on days of soft breezes and on days when the air arrived in hard, restless pushes. Whenever the wind was strong enough, the pattern repeated. The crow would land at one end of the wall and begin its slow walk along the top. As it moved from one cluster of carved marks to the next, the wind would rise or fall. At certain points, it would press harder. At others, it would thin to almost nothing. The bird felt as if invisible fingers were tracing the letters below. The names were mostly unreadable to people now. Many of the families who had once visited the memorial had moved away or grown old. On the anniversaries that still appeared on calendars, a small group of officials sometimes arrived with wreaths and short speeches. They stood at a distance, where the lines of text blended into pale stripes. Then they left. Only a few curious passersby ever came close. Sometimes a child, dragged to the park by a parent, would wander up to the wall and look for the letters that matched someone in their own class at school. Sometimes a man walking his dog would stop for a moment and try to find a familiar surname. More often, eyes slid over the stone without really seeing it. The crow did not read, but it watched. It noticed that people's feet almost never touched certain sections of the ground near the wall. The grass there grew longer, then browned undisturbed. It noticed that the benches at the edge of the park faced the road and the bus depot, not the line of names. The bird kept walking the wall. With time, the crow began to change its movement. At first, it had followed the simplest path, start at one end, move to the other, step by step, as the wind followed. After many weeks of this pattern, the crow started to pause. It would stand above a certain row and look down, tilting its head from side to side. At those spots, the wind often did something different. Sometimes it rose suddenly, almost sharply, like a voice that insists on being heard. Sometimes it dropped away in the middle of a gust, as if choking on a missing word. The crow could not explain any of this, but it remembered. Gradually, the bird built a map inside its mind. There were places along the wall where the air always pressed a little harder. There were others where a faint echo lingered for a heartbeat after each breath of wind passed. The crow began to hop back and forth between these points, skipping sections where the air stayed flat. From a distance, it would have looked as if the bird were counting. The crow would land, take a fixed number of steps, then hop sideways, then return, tracing an invisible pattern. Each hop seemed to call up a response from the wind. Each pause pulled a slightly longer murmur from the stone. Below the wall, the city continued its life. Buses came and went from the depot. Drivers shouted to each other and slammed doors. Mechanics hammered and swore at stubborn engines. Children in bright jackets crossed the park, staring at their phones. On some days, a group of teenagers gathered near the garages, their music leaking from small speakers. Most of them did not notice the crow. The bird was only another piece of city sky, a dark wedge of wings crossing between lampposts, a black shape on the edge of a roof, a quick shadow. Crows were everywhere, and people had learned to let their eyes slide past them. One person did see. There was a groundskeeper whose job it was to collect trash from the park, sweep the paths, and occasionally wash the lower part of the wall with a hose. He was not young, not old, and he walked with the slow patience of someone who knew that the work would never truly be finished. On mornings after strong winds, he would find leaves and scraps piled against the base of the memorial. He would bend to gather them and feel, faintly, an echo of last night's gusts in his shoulders and neck. More than once, while he worked, he looked up and saw the crow. The bird moved along the top of the wall with an odd regularity. It stepped, paused, stepped again. Sometimes it hopped back the way it had come, only to repeat the same measured motions. The groundskeeper watched this dance with mild curiosity. On a cold morning when the wind cut in hard from the fields, he heard something else. As the crow reached a point above the middle of the wall and stopped, the air lifted across the stone. The gust caught the man's jacket and tugged it. At the same time, a thin, rising sound came from the carved rose. It lasted only a heartbeat. It could easily have been the scrape of a branch or the hiss of passing traffic. Yet to the groundskeeper's ear, tuned by years of working around plans and markers and ceremonies, it sounded like something halfway between a breath and a syllable. He straightened and slowly stepped closer. The crow did not move at first. It stood at its place, head tilted, feathers tight against the wind. Then it took 3 deliberate steps forward and stopped again, now above another cluster of names. The wind rose and fell. Another fragment of sound came. No clear word, only the feeling of a word. A shape of voice made by air passing unevenly over stone. The man could not turn those fragments back into the names that had once been read aloud here during ceremonies. Those letters had faded too much. But he understood, with a simple, steady certainty, that the pattern was not random. The wind was following the bird. The groundskeeper did not talk about this with anyone. When people came for official events, they spoke of maintenance schedules and budgets, of how many wreaths would be needed and how long the speeches should be. There was no room in those conversations for a crow that walked the wall while the air whispered. Still, after that morning, he made a quiet change to his routine. Before, when he washed the lower part of the wall, he had moved quickly, letting the water run down in wide sheets, pushing away dirt and dust in long strokes. Now, he slowed. He followed the crow's path as he remembered it, paying more attention to the sections where the bird often paused. He could not restore the sharp edges of the letters, but he could keep those particular places a little clearer, a little less obscured by grime and moss. It felt like a small form of help. The crow noticed the water. On days after cleaning, the stone below certain spots shone a little more when the light hit it. The grooves of the letters held tiny beads of moisture. When the wind passed over them, the sound changed again. The whisper became slightly sharper, the edge of an unsaid word more defined. The bird adjusted its steps once more. It began each walk at the same place, near the left end, where the first line started. From there, it would move in a measured way, like a reader following rows in an unknown script. Sometimes, it would spread its wings just a little, feeling the lift of the wind on its feathers, as the air thickened along a particular row. On certain evenings, when the sky sent long rays of orange light across the park, the crow's black body cast a shadow on the wall. To someone passing by at the right moment, it might have looked as if a moving dark hand rested on the stone, touching each line in turn. The crow did not know this. It only knew the tug of air and the faint sound that answered the pressure of its claws. The seasons turned. Snow came once, then less and less in later years, falling in wet clumps that melted quickly on the dark stone. Spring brought a flush of green to the small trees and to the moss along the base of the wall. Summer baked the concrete and made the letters seem to sink deeper into the bright surface. Through all these changes, the crow kept its pattern. There were days when it did not come, when it followed other currents above other streets, searching for food or safer night perches. Yet it always returned, drawn by a pull it did not fully understand. The wind changed too. Some days it arrived only as a warm breath from the city, smelling of exhaust and fried food. On those days, the whispers were weak. On others, when air rushed in from the fields with enough force to bend branches, the wall spoke strongly. The crow would feel the pressure like a hand along its wings. What began as accident had become a kind of shared habit. The wall could not move, but it carried within it the marks of many human hands and the stories of lives interrupted. The wind could move freely, but without shape it became only noise. The crow could move and choose where to land, but it could not understand what lay under its claws. Together, they made something halfway between silence and reading. In a city full of screens and small glowing letters, there were not many who cared about such things. Yet the world keeps more memory than people notice. On a late autumn afternoon, when clouds were low and heavy, a woman passed through the park on her way from the bus depot. She had once come here as a child, holding an adult's hand, forced to stand still during a ceremony. At that time, the wall had seemed too high, the names too many. She had not visited in many years. Her life had filled with other worries: work, a small apartment, the constant hurry of days. The wall had faded in her mind, the way the names had faded in the stone. Now, while she cut across the park, Something made her stop. Perhaps it was the sudden cooling of the air as a gust came over the fields. Perhaps it was the sight of the crow moving along the top of the wall in a slow, precise way. Perhaps it was only the way the late light caught the damp stone and drew out a faint line of letters that matched a surname from old stories in her family. She turned toward the wall and took a few steps closer. The crow reached one of its usual stopping points and froze. The air pressed against the woman's coat. A thin, rising sound came from the stone. It was soft and incomplete, but for her, tuned by memory rather than by years of yard work. It felt almost like a half-heard familiar name. She stood there longer than she had planned. Her bus left without her. Another would come. For the first time in a long while, she walked slowly along the length of the wall, reading what she could. Some names were gone. Some were still clear. She moved her lips silently. Above her, the crow hopped from line to line, tracing its own route. Each time the woman paused, the wind seemed to answer with a slightly stronger gust, as if pleased that someone had joined this quiet work. Leaves rattled along the fence. A plastic bag lifted and fell. In the months that followed, a few more people drifted back. Not many, and not often. A man who had spent his childhood in this district came one day because the bus route had changed. A group of students came with a teacher who still believed monuments mattered. A driver from the depot crossed the park on a break, drawn by a sudden curiosity about the stone he saw every day from a distance. None of them knew about the crow's map or the groundskeeper's careful cleaning. They only felt that the wall still carried something worth standing in front of for a short while. The crow did not count visitors. It counted only its steps and the invisible checkpoints along the top of the wall. On warm, still days, when the air barely stirred, it would sit and wait until a stronger gust arrived. When it came, the bird would launch into its slow walk, letting the wind read whatever it could from the faded letters. To the city, the memorial remained a minor place. It did not appear in tourist guides. It did not trend on any feed. It sat where it had always been, at the edge, between buses and garages and a narrow strip of tired grass. But on days when the clouds moved quickly and the branches bent, something happened there that no one had planned. A crow walked its familiar line. The wind ran along the stone. Together, they lifted small fragments of forgotten voices into the air, just for a moment, before carrying them away over rooftops and streets. The wall did not know it was being read. The crow did not know it was reading. The wind did not know it was speaking. Yet between them, the names on the old stone were not entirely silent.